button.
Forward.
And
if you start
I see Kathy came on, so welcome, Kathy, and welcome again, Carol. Great to see y'all. Here we go for another show.
Great, and I'm going to have Zach start the screen share, and then I'm going to tell you this is a little bit of a new topic. I think you're going to like this. The photo curator suggested it, and I thought, yeah, this is something new. So today we're going to talk about photography and portraiture. And I think, again, you're going to be really, really intrigued by this because almost as soon as photography is invented, in 1839, it becomes a kind of a tool for portraiture and a way of capturing the most important figures of the day in politics, in arts, and sciences. You know, this is the way we think of and understand. When you think about it, Abraham Lincoln, right, or Harriet Tubman, or Frederick Douglass. It's that image. It's that photographic image and the way the photographer has framed them. You are looking now at a 360-degree portrait, which I think is a brilliant idea, from the French photographer named Nadar. Nadar was a pioneering photographer, as well as being a really interesting character. He was a performer, he was a journalist, a big bohemian, kind of a left-wing agitator and a playwright and a caricaturist. He was a buddy of the Impressionists and gave his studio as the space for their very first exhibition. And he was also, this I have to say, I love, he was an early aeronaut. He was a hot air balloonist. So I love this idea that this is his self-portrait because I think it gives you that sense there's many facets to this guy. And he's going to show you even the back of his head. I don't know, very, very intriguing. And probably one of the most important early photographers, and certainly the most important early portraits. Next image, please. And this is Nadar again. This is a cartoon of Nadar, and the first person ever to take an aerial photograph in history. And I love this fun cartoon of him in action. But he's best known really for his portraits. And he had to be, when you think about it, early photographers had to be part scientists because they're still really kind of tweaking their technique and the chemistry involved. And they're part artists, and they are absolutely part salesmen. And he really succeeded in all three. Next image, please. He was the first great portrait photographer. And what sets him apart is a very sensitive feeling for light. He was the first person ever to use electric light in a studio, and he made connections with the sitters. He wanted something that was intimate and gave you a sense of the kind of the real personality and the psychology of a sitter as well. Up until this point, if you had your portrait either painted or you'd had a photograph taken, I would have put something that showed, that really communicated who you were. So simply put, there would have been a prop or a background or something that says, oh yes, if I was doing a portrait of, Priscilla, I would have had, we would have had some connection or allusion right to the knitting and the knitting needles. There was a prop or a symbol that helped to define something about you and your loves and your passions, right? So all different here. All of a sudden, he's really going to focus on the sitter's face and the character and the personality. Now, does anybody know who this is? Any guesses? One of the most famous people of the 19th century. The most famous actress of the 19th century. Anybody know? Okay. This is Sarah Bernhardt. And you look at, right, she's all kind of energy and drama. Now, in the past, if you'd said, oh, I'm going to, paint or I'm going to photograph Sarah Bernhardt, you might have put her in the costume from a role, right? In maybe a dramatic pose or a wacky facial expression. But he chooses to not do any of that. Instead, he's just going to show you the person. and again give you something of her energy and her character and her personality. So this is a whole new thing, whole new ball game. Next image, please. Traditionally, if I painted or I photographed an artist, that artist needed those attributes, needed those props. That artist would have had the palette and the brushes and maybe the easel and maybe a painter's smock in the background to communicate, to telegraph who they were. Instead, you get a photograph like this. What you see is the face, that solid gaze, the long, bristly beard, the calm, gentle strength. And this is Claude Monet.
Oh,
Fascinating. I think this is a whole new idea of capturing personality and character. Again, instead of just thinking about props. And one more Nadar to show you with the next one. Alexander Dumas, the great writer of the classics. And again, not holding a book, not doing anything else that indicates this is an important novelist, but instead something of this kind of immediacy and personality and spark that shows you, well, this is a real person. And there's just something about him. He feels like he's engaging right with us. Next image, please. This is a very famous portrait by Edward Steichen. Steichen was a hugely influential and prolific photographer. And this sitter is the financier J.P. Morgan. This sitting only lasted a couple of months, and Steichen only took 2 photographs. But this one would serve to define J.P. Morgan, well, forever, up until this day. This is Morgan, this great steel and railroad magnate with the power, literally, to influence the entire U.S. economy. It's funny, he looks much older, but in this photograph, he's just 65. Steichen again took 1 photograph. That one was apparently not particularly distinctive, but benign. Then the photographer asked Morgan to just shift a little bit. Said, well, can you just move a little bit like this? Steichen later related that Morgan was just totally annoyed. Here's this captain of industry, and the photographer is saying, can you do a little of this, a little of that? He said it only took a second. But in that second, when Steichen said, can you shift? Morgan was he was annoyed, ticked off. His posture shifted, and his face, in that 1 second, kind of reflected this annoyance, his mood. The first shot the photographer made was totally innocuous, and the second one is this one. And this, of course, is the famous one. It gives you a sense of somebody who's kind of forbidding and intimidating. I love the fact that the mustache, of course, forms this kind of perfect frown. He had a kind of a medical condition, but a skin condition. So he did have a rather large inflamed nose, which is prominent here, a little bit beak-like. You can get a sense of his girth, and I love the eyes. Steichen said they were like, and this is a quote, headlights of an express train heading right for you. And what I really love too, and this is, I think, a rather accidental thing here, is that if you look at the arms of the chair that he is sitting in, you see that right below his hand, what it appears to be, and it is the arm of the chair.
I thought it was a knife.
Exactly. It has the look of a dagger, but it really is the arm, the chair arm, but it has the look of a dagger, and that makes it even more kind of frightening and intimidating. You've got this kind of, pirate of the financial world. So it becomes really, really distinctive. And Steichen, just a really fascinating photographer. He believed, in his words, you needed to surprise the subject into revealing something in themselves. So he said, in that one moment where he tells Morgan, how can you adjust your pose? Morgan reveals this kind of fierce annoyance, and that's what he captures. So it's a fascinating photograph and probably one of the most famous portraits in history. Next image, please. This is another Edward Steichen. Extra credit if anybody knows who this is. 1924. Anybody know? I'm a little disappointed. I'm going to tell you them. Okay. This is Steichen's photograph of Gloria Swanson. Right? Actress who was, of course, very, very well known in silent films and a huge sensation, as well as later in her career, coming back for Sunset Boulevard in the early 50s. He had had a very long session with her for Vogue magazine, many changes of costume, different lighting effects. And at the very end of this long, long day, Steichen took a little piece of black lace veil and he just put it in front of her face.
Huh.
He said she caught on to this idea. These are his words. She loved it. Her eyes dilated and her look was that of a leopardess lurking behind leafy shrubbery, watching her prey. I thought, what a brilliant idea. The right photographer actually reveals something and gives us a deeper insight, of course, into the sitter. There's something so alluring and dramatic about this photograph of Gloria Swanson. Also, just mysterious. And we're focused on the pattern of that lace, which is fascinating too. But those eyes, it both reveals and it conceals something about her. And there's a fascinating effect in putting that pattern of the lace on top of her face. And of course, she was very, very young. Shockingly, I don't know if there's any film buffs in this group or fans of Sunset Boulevard. I was shocked to reveal, of course, Norma Desmond is thought to be this ancient, ancient woman. And one realizes, of course, Gloria Swanson was not that old when she made the film. And she was very, very young. In this photograph, she's 25 years old. And she was only in her very early 50s in Sunset Boulevard. Next image, please. This is a photograph, of course, of George O'Keeffe by Alfred Stieglitz. Stieglitz was not only a very famous photographer, but he was a writer, he was a critic, he was a gallery owner of the place to show contemporary art in the early part of the 20th century. He was a big advocate of modern art, and he was the person who said, you know, I'm going to have the first Picasso show, or the first Rodin show. He was on the cutting edge. O'Keeffe and Stieglitz met in 1916. She had sent a roll of very experimental, very abstract charcoal drawings to her buddy, Anita Politzer, who unrolled them and thought, these are quite extraordinary. And she took them down to his gallery. He was just dumbstruck, displayed them without George O'Keeffe's permission. And they then met in person, and he won her over, and they soon fell in love, became lovers. Later, he divorced, and they did marry. But as part of this long, fascinating relationship and mentorship, he eventually took over 300 photographic portraits of her.
Oh.
And they're in all different states. You know, some are nude, some are clothed, some are this kind of dramatic gazing into the distance, like this one. Others are, you know, just her hands, or just her torso, or just her breasts. Some are really erotic and intimate. They're just all different facets of her, which I think is fascinating. Over 300. He wrote, or no, actually she wrote, that Stieglitz's idea of a portrait was never just one picture. That it wasn't possible to take a personality that would just simply not fit into one image. You needed many, many images. Next picture, please. And of course, these are her hands. So he isolated pretty much all the body parts, but it's a full portrait with many, many pieces and many facets. It makes me think of the first image I showed you, Nadar giving us a 360. And this is, in a sense, a 360-degree portrait of George O'Keeffe by her lover, partner, later husband.
That's a thimble and she's sewing, correct?
That's
Neat, very neat.
Isn't that fascinating? But there's just something that's really exciting.
Delicate.
Yeah. He said that a portrait should concern much more than the face. And again, this is his quote: it should be a record of a person's entire experience. I love this phrase, a mosaic of movements and gestures that evoke a whole life. So this is nothing that can be done in one shot, as per Stieglitz. He said to demand that a portrait will be a complete portrait of any person is as futile as to demand that a motion picture be condensed into a single image. I thought that's kind of a nice analogy too. Next image, please. This is a work by the surrealist artist named Man Ray of an American actress named Ella Raines, who's known for her film noir performances. I don't think in the previous years anyone would have thought of creating a portrait and obscuring half the face. That's exactly what he's done. It's mysterious, it's dramatic. More than anything, it's fittingly cinematic. This does look like a still from a movie, and it looks like a still from a film noir. What is hidden, what is revealed, also makes me think a little bit about the experimentation of an artist like Picasso, who will distort and contort the face, make it a bit mask-like, and perhaps just show you part of the face. And that, of course, was certainly never done before in a painting before Picasso, and certainly not done in a photograph before, to only give you a little bit of that image. But I think it's fittingly dramatic and cinematic and mysterious as well. Next image, please. Margaret Bourke-White, of course, one of the most famous photographers of the 20th century, absolute dynamo, worked first for Fortune magazine starting in 1929, and of course Luce knew a good thing when he had it. And when he starts Life magazine in 1936, she's one of the very first 4 photographers, and of course the only woman photographer on the staff, and she gets the first cover, and she's just the superstar. So she is sent on assignments all over the United States and all over the world, and portraiture of the most influential figures of the century is really part of her portfolio, shall we say. After the Second World War, she is sent off to India in 1946 to cover the collapse of the British Empire and to cover Gandhi. She makes an appointment to see Gandhi. He is staying in a sprawling slum with the untouchables. As soon as she arrives, his secretary, Gandhi's secretary, asked Margaret Bourke-White if she knows how to spin. Of course, she said, no, I don't know how to spin. And the spinning wheel is really significant to Gandhi's drive to get the British out of India. Indian cotton was turned into cloth in British mills, and then, of course, sold back to India. So he's saying, you got to break this chain of dependency. We're spinning our own cotton. So that spinning wheel is really important. So Bourke-White, she doesn't know how to spin, doesn't care, but she knows she needs to do this to get the photo. So she takes her spinning lesson, then is admitted, she passes the test, and then as soon as she gets ready to go into his room, she's told it's his day of silence. She shouldn't speak to him, nor could she use artificial light because he didn't like that. So she is kind of beside herself. She finally begs for a couple little flash bulbs, 3 little flash bulbs. She walks in and finds him sitting, as we see him, cross-legged on the floor, this hand-woven loincloth. He's got a little stack of newspapers and clippings, looking through those very, very characteristic little steel-rimmed glasses and looking somewhat frail. This is what she finds. And again, he paid absolutely no attention to her. She invades his time and space. He continues reading. She uses the very first of the 3 flash bulbs. Heat and moisture ruined it. Nothing happened. Next flash bulb, fizzle. The 3rd one works and creates this very, very iconic portrait of Gandhi. Again, looking, this light creating almost a kind of a halo effect humble, meditative figure, looking very much like a saint. She photographs him all the time. Then after this, he nicknames her, dubs her the torturer. She does so beautifully. You know, we talked about Nadar not putting in props or things to help define you. She does just the opposite. That spinning wheel is so important to his identity and to the push for independence and the collapse of the British Empire. It is in the foreground and he's in the background. So just fascinating. And of course, she photographs everybody. Gandhi, Patton, Churchill, FDR. One of the most difficult, though, apparently, to photograph and to get the sitting is the next image, please. It's Stalin. Asks again and again for a sitting. She's turned down. They ignore her. Finally, FDR's colleague, aide, Harry Hopkins, intervenes. She gets the audience. She waits for almost 2 hours. She reports she was utterly shocked to find a figure not larger than life, but somebody. She was shocked, a little short, lean, pockmarked. She reminds him that she had actually photographed his mother during an earlier trip that she made to the Soviet Union. She said he didn't respond, not a word, or even a muscle twitch. Love this quote. Margaret Bourke-White said, "He was one of the few subjects of my camera who would not obey me." Isn't that an interesting way to phrase that? As she knelt to photograph him, often she would do this from below. The flash bulbs that were in her pockets spilled out and rolled across the floor. She had to jump up and chase them. She said as she did that, Stalin actually began to smile a little bit, just the beginnings of a chuckle, and she caught that very, very faint smile before, in her words, he reverted to marble. So these stories behind these sittings are just so intriguing and so fascinating. Next image, please. This is a photograph that I'm guessing many of you have seen. Very famous photograph by Barbara Morgan of the great modern dancer and choreographer Martha Graham. This is from 1940. Early in her career as a photographer, Barbara Morgan arrives in New York City, mid-1930s, just as Martha Graham is taking off as a really important figure in the modern dance world. So they met, I guess, after a performance. Morgan went to introduce herself. They hit it off immediately and agreed to a collaborative effort. And they did actually 4 books together. This piece is an image from a ballet called Letters to the World, inspired by the work of Emily Dickinson. Barbara Morgan said this was incredibly difficult shot. She had 4 different assistants on the set with lamps and lighting and a very, very fast speed, 1/600th of a second. And she was intent on trying to blur the floor and focus and capture this movement. And Martha Graham, of course, reported that she had to do this movement again and again and again until they captured it. I want you to look at the lines of this image. Look at the line of the torso, which, of course, perfectly echoes the line of the floor, and that amazing arc of the kick that answers the bend in the arm, and just the stillness of the face, the motion of the body and the drapery, but the stillness of the face, I think, are quite amazing. Morgan said what she was trying to do, this is an interesting phrase as well, was to try to show pictures of, her phrase, spiritual energy. And this is one, maybe you've seen this before, but probably the most famous photograph of dance, certainly, and most famous photograph of Martha Graham as well. Next image, please. Gordon Parks, of course, was one of the most versatile artists of the 20th century. Gordon Parks was a photographer, and a novelist, and a memoirist, and a poet, musical composer, filmmaker, first African-American to ever direct a Hollywood film. shaft, of course, and the learning tree, and the first African American photographer at Life magazine and at the Farm Security Administration. So he was a pioneer in many different areas. For Life magazine, he did two. We did many, many different features, but he did two specifically on Muhammad Ali, one in '66 and one in 1970. And for anyone who has recently seen the wonderful Ken Burns multi-part series, of course, Ali was a very controversial figure, many objecting to his political views and his protest of the Vietnam War and his religious views, Nation of Islam. These features were meant in many ways to give us a more well-rounded picture of Muhammad Ali. During these features or during these spreads, Gordon Parks would follow him, training, sparring, spending time with his family, playing with his kids, joking, at prayer. And many suggested that this really was responsible for giving, again, a more well-rounded or more human portrait of the heavyweight boxer. Here, Gordon Parks has given us this close-up, cropped so close, just to focus on part of Ali's chest, his face, the perspiration, the textures, the intensity, and the physical power, and then this gaze going off into the distance, not joking with us, not clowning around, but somehow looking far off into the distance. You get a sense here of just that sheer intensity and brutality of life as a boxer and life in this physical combat. Next image, please. This is one more Gordon Parks. The Fontanelles at the Poverty Board. Not a celebrity portrait, but a really important piece that I wanted to share and include as part of a 16-page feature about a Harlem family, the Fontanelles. That was in Life magazine. Unemployed dad, exhausted mom, 9 kids. Like every single photo that we've looked at, it's all about the point of view. And this is a group portrait, and the point of view is essential. Gordon Parks has put us, the viewer, behind the bureaucrat at the Poverty Board. We see the tired mother. We see the anxious kids. We seem to be, as the viewer, in the position of granting or withholding assistance to this family. But it's all in the point of view. All in the point of view. Next image, please. You may be familiar with a very famous photographer named Philippe Halsman, who did a jump book, which he asked celebrities to pose for portraits jumping. And he felt that jumping, the very nature and act of jumping, would reveal something about your personality. So Google this if you don't know the book or the images, because you will see the most amazing images of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor jumping, or Richard Nixon, or Marilyn Monroe. All fascinating and revealing. This is, of course, the great surrealist artist Salvador Dali, who had been friends with Halsman for many, many years. And Halsman, of course, was a Life magazine photographer as well. This piece, they decided that a portrait of Dali needed to be just as surreal as Dali's paintings were. This photograph took, I believe by the report of Halsman's daughter, some 28 attempts to achieve this. And what they actually did, I think it was Mrs. Halsman who was off camera holding one leg of a chair. So that's the magical suspension at the left. They had some little, like almost like fishing filament that was holding up the paintings and the easels, so that those seemed to be suspended in midair. Dali's job, of course, was to leap in the air, and, well, another assistant had to take 3 cats and toss them in the air while somebody else was throwing the water. So I can't imagine that these cats would have, wanted to do it more than once.
I can't believe that wasn't fake. That's just absolutely amazing that they did all that in live action.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating, I think it's really the daughter of the photographer who tells you more about it. And of course, today, obviously, you could do all kinds of crazy things so easily with Photoshop. But when this was done, I think this was done in 1948, the only way was the hard way. So she said after every attempt, then somebody would come in. Of course, the chair and the thing suspended would be there, but then somebody would have to come, mop the floor, get the water, dry off the cats, and do it again. Poor cats, I can't imagine. Can't imagine. But I've read both in two different versions. One said it took 26 attempts, and another one was 28. But it's a perfect expression as a portrait of Salvador Dali. It's surreal, it's magical, it's nonsensical. And you do think, well, how in the world? How did he do that? But it's perfect. It's got a kind of a dreamy quality or nightmarish, depending on your feelings about this. But it works. And again, if you don't know him, Philippe Halsman, Google the Jump book, and you can see him capturing many, many famous figures of the 20th century jumping. Yeah, it's fascinating to see Nixon jumping. Not quite as playful, shall we say, as Marilyn Monroe doing the same thing. All right, next image, please. This is also a Halsman, Philippe Halsman. This is fascinating because in many ways, this figure almost suggests like a Charles Adams, doesn't it? A Morticia. But this is another actress named Ricky Soma. And I include it because I thought you'd be most intrigued to know the baby is Angelica Houston. So something just in many ways calm and traditional and very 19th century about this piece. There's a serenity, a Mona Lisa, feel about it, but kind of intriguing about who it is too. Next image, please, is by a photographer named Mary Ellen Mark. You may know many, many portraits of Hollywood celebrities. Portraits also, she did a big project of twins where she, studied and photographed twins from throughout the entire world. Also interested, she did a big project on marginalized communities and followed homeless families. One of the things she did too, you may remember this just years ago, just when I started at the Johnson, she actually came to town as part of a project and a book she did covering high school proms. And they were from everywhere, Salt Lake City or West Virginia or Texas. And one of the sites, believe it or not, was Ithaca, New York. So she went to the Ithaca High School prom and took some extraordinary photographs there that are now in the permanent collection of the Johnson. But she's quite well known for doing her assignments on movie sets. And these wouldn't just be going in for a day. These would be spending weeks on a movie set. She might be on the set of One Flew Over Cuckoo's Nest or Blues Brothers or here, Apocalypse Now. And, she said she was dressed in fatigues and sloshing through the mud until, as she said, she would just blend in. And some of these things were posed. Others were clowning around. Others were images where she just happened to capture something at the moment. And this so fascinating. She said, I guess Marlon Brando reached out, took a bug, a beetle, put it on his head, and posed for her. But somehow this is revealing, I think, and something fascinating about him. Gives you some sense of that famous intensity that he had for immersing himself in his roles. And of course, his Colonel Kurtz could not have been a more crazed role in Apocalypse Now. And somehow looking up at us with that gaze and that bald head, and frightening and engaging at the same time. Next image, got a couple, just three more to show you here. Arnold Newman was one of the most prominent photographers of the 20th century. Life magazine, Vanity Fair, very well known for what he called environmental portraits, putting his sitter in a setting that helped you to know them. This is just quite contrary to where we started with Nadar removing those settings. But for Arnold Newman, it was important that you knew something about that person. This is, of course, Igor Stravinsky, a Russian composer, and the pianist, and the conductor. I love this because it's so very simple. This entire composition, dominated by the grand piano, silhouetted against the white wall, with the composer, is just tucked into the corner. His arm, of course, echoes the line of the piano. And the top of the piano almost looks like a big musical note as well. Just fascinating. And what I love is that the man himself is such a tiny part of this. Somehow the music, the instrument is the portrait. You know, and Stravinsky's just kind of tucked away there in the corner. But Google Newman too, because every important figure of the 50s, 60s, 70s, he captures in fascinating ways. Next image, please. Including this is Dr. Jonas Salk, very timely here, the inventor of the polio vaccine. I love this as an idea of a setting. He's at the Salk Institute here, but the geometry of this, that sense of line, you know, and the concrete of the building, and the little fences, and the shadows, looking off into the distance. Another piece is just doorway after doorway after doorway after doorway. And somehow that sense that as someone doing medical research, you are just going to have to keep going beyond, going beyond, and going beyond till you get what you need. And that, I think, is a part of this too. I love the fact, like Stravinsky, Salk is just off at the side. And we're really looking, before we were looking at that piano, and here we're looking at this series of, of doorways that go into something we can't even really tell what's in the future. But kind of a fascinating idea, and I love this pose. And we've got just one more that takes us full circle. My old friends, Alfred Stieglitz and George O'Keeffe. Again, this is done by Newman, almost 30 years into their relationship. So again, they meet when he unrolls those drawings and displays them without her permission. That was 1916. This is 1944. By this time, of course, they have been in partnership, lovers, you know, husband and wife. But what a fascinating look into their lives. To see O'Keeffe in the background, almost like a Whistler's mother, not engaging with us at all, and not engaging with him. And then Stieglitz, just a couple years really before his death, right there, so prominent, taking us on as the viewer. Two artists, two individuals, two strong people. And I think a fascinating way to show them together. Each of these photographers opens up a new way to look at the sitter, tells us something about them, and gives us an image that I think helps us to look deeper into the subject of the portrait in a very different way. So that is the last one I have for today. If anybody has any questions, happy to answer them. I'm delighted to get to see you on this cool, beautiful, crisp November morning. Got anything?
I have just a couple of comments. Number one, it's sort of interesting with the photographs of Gandhi and the others, that the message there was that the work was kind of more important than the person, you know, which is interesting with Stravinsky and whatever, but their work sort of was much greater than they were on some level.
That's an interesting observation. You're right. And that work, you're right. The work is more important, and the work goes on and on and on.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Good point. Good point.
And then the other thing I wanted to say is that I find your talks really, really inspiring. In fact, they were so inspiring that a group of us went and visited the Johnson in person to see the indigenous portraitures or the works.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad.
Thank you.
I wish we were in person, but this is something. I'm just so delighted we can connect in this way.
It's great. It's great. I love it. I love this photo. I don't think I've ever seen a photograph of him before. I've seen his photographs. I haven't, it's interesting.
Yeah, and I think it is fascinating too. And of course, there's quite an age difference between the two of them. What, maybe 25 years.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
But he dies, I think, in the late 1940s. So this is very, very late in his life. And you think she goes on to what, 97, something like that? She has a very, very long life. And many, when you think about it, many, many productive years for her after this image.
Yeah.
Were they posing for another photographer? Was he setting it up, and is this his picture?
Oh, I think this is his picture. I think that Arnold Newman said, this is what I want to do. And I think that he posed folks in the ways that he wanted to and wanted to express. And I think, again, with all of these folks, I think they usually posed people, but some, like Steichen, wanted to kind of change it up and surprise you and do or say something that maybe would make you reveal something. But I think Arnold Newman very much said, let's do it like this. Yeah. And, Zach was asking earlier if there are folks who have any other topics. I do have a George O'Keeffe, if anybody's interested in that, for another talk that I'd be happy to do, or if there are other topics, just let me know.
I'm kind of interested in the dresses right now, since it dovetails with what's in the costume collection.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The dresses that are in the show in Nancy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And she is so good about always pulling in the textiles and costume into her shows. I wish I knew. I would have to do some research. I don't know that much about those pieces, but might be able to find out some more.
I also have to say that there's still something about black and white, which is particularly intense compared to color.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I would rather see it black and white. I really would, particularly as a portrait.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, I would agree with it.
Well, anybody else? Anything else? What a nice, interesting selection of pictures. I enjoyed that.
Yeah, delighted to be with you all. I'll look forward to another adventure, and I hope everybody can get out on this gorgeous day.
And you've given another good reason to come back to the Johnson.
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you so much.
All right, take care.
Thank you.
Have a good one, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.